Okay, well, so what I wanted to ask you about was in your title for today's event, you were talking about cycles of innovation and the idea that sometimes they're closed, sometimes they're open. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, well, the reason I wrote this book, we've all been living in this sort of era of great optimism, almost idealism about the internet. And I've shared a lot in it. I believe in it as well. And I've worked in Silicon Valley, and I've been a real part of it. But I've been very interested. I think that what happens is, in the long picture, technologies tend to go through these long waves of open periods and closed periods. And if you look at all the other sort of new technologies of the 20th century, they had very similar beginnings to the internet. Radio in the 1920s was, especially in the United States, a very idealistic medium that was sort of going to change everything. And film also had this phase, 1910s, where it was sort of anyone can make a film, anyone can get into it. It was, you could have a startup. The telephone also had this period. Different countries are different, but the United States in particular, where everybody was building phone lines, was kind of start your own phone shop. And all these things ultimately became these incredibly consolidated, integrated, centralized industries. So the real question, I think, when we look at our period right now, is whether we've changed everything forever, or we're just sort of in an open part of a long cycle where it will also close again.
And what's your feeling? Are you just raising the issue, or are you...
I think that the challenge for someone who believes in an open internet and an open information environment, like I do, that we shouldn't just believe it will stay that way, kind of automatically, that we've sort of conquered the demons. Because every single medium that has believed this has also eventually closed. So I think we have to be very careful in trying to sustain something we've got, to see if we can keep it the way it is, as opposed to assume we've sort of conquered or changed information forever. Because they all tend, every single other medium, as I said, has gone through these phases and closed again.
I'm going to ask you about some examples.
Sure.
That's the interesting idea. How about this as a counter-argument to play, the reverse of the devil's advocate in this case? So looking at even the ideas from Buran and the military focus, not billing but resilience, etc., with ARPANET, all the way through the RFCs, the request for comments, the victory of X25, or the defeat of X25 by TCP. Everything that has happened before the thing went commercial was kind of open, it seemed to have that open character.
Right.
So is it that something happened, in the early 90s since the handover and the commercial thing, or is it something since then even?
Look, I think it's a very astute question, because the internet was the only medium that's ever been designed to be an open medium. In governance structure, every other one was designed essentially as an empire, run by a single person. Often they were small industries, but they were designed to be owned. You owned the network, one person owned it. The internet is the first that has what you might call a Republican governance structure. Users own it. But Republican structures in any system are hard to maintain. They tend to flip back to monarchy, back to empires. Very hard to maintain. So I agree it has those origins. And if it didn't have those origins, the internet would be the cable system. They were both born at the same time. Now, I'm mostly talking about the United States. Most countries don't have extensive cable systems. But you think about cable television. Both were born at the same time. Not everyone knows this. There was a period where people were very idealistic about what cable will be. There was a report in 1970 that says cable television may be as important as the printing press, maybe more. It will bring us a new age of interactive information. People will be able to sort of shop online, visit their neighbors. This was all what cable was going to do. So there was this idea that cable television was this utopian technology. It flipped, obviously. And I agree with you. The only reason the internet has a constitution which makes it different, but it could still flip.
What do you mean by a constitution?
Exactly what you said, the TCP.
Oh, okay.
I don't mean a legal constitution.
Yeah.
I mean the TCP, I mean Buran's design, I mean some of the later work on end-to-end theory. Although, I have a chapter on this. Unfortunately, a lot of
in a year we'll be delighted to read it.
Yeah. Well, no, you could read it whenever. I don't care about that stuff. A lot of it happened, I believe. It wasn't necessarily planned to be this way. I think some of it happened, the design of the internet, because the creators of the internet were not strong enough to impose their will over everybody. They had this idea.
Right, yeah.
They had this idea. I got this idea from interviewing Vin Cerf and other people. Yeah. It wasn't so much that they said, okay, let's create this layered network where everyone... Yeah. It's like, it's more that, well, we don't really have any power. We want to do this thing. We have to get everyone to agree. We have to get all these different systems to speak to each other. Yeah. And we can't just sort of tell them to redesign everything. Yes, so we need a lingua franca, an Esperanto, hence the TCP protocol. Yeah. So I think some of this design, a little bit like, European federalism in some ways. There's no way... the way the EU is the way it is not just because that's how they would like it. Perhaps there's certain people who would like to create a United States of Europe. But it's because the European countries are so powerful, you have to deal with them the way they are.
So it's a kind of a centrally compromised system.
But those compromised systems are very good sometimes.
So on the one hand, you got this Valian idea, Theodore Vail, and that is universal service. If you want something robust. And on the other hand, you've got this wartime service, which is if you want something nuclear proof, you have to have this distributed system. And very interesting how they meet and clash and things like that. I spoke to someone involved in the Internet Task Force.
Can I say that Vail is a very important figure in my book?
Really?
Yeah, Vail is the ideological leader of a theory of sort of enlightened empire communications.
Can you explain enlightened?
He has this sense that there's three things about Vail that define his thinking. First, he believes that everything must be centralized, run by a single authority with absolute power. Second, he believes that he must work very carefully with the government, that the communications authority and the government must be partners, which in a lot of countries it's just state-owned, but he believed that he volunteered to be regulated, which if you imagine imagine now sort of Microsoft saying, help us run our operating system, it just seems kind of unbelievable. But the last thing was, and I think the most sympathetic thing about Vail, is he really had these ideas that he had to run this as a public utility. Right. That the phone system that he was not to seek profit as the highest goal, but rather the public good. So he ended up being this sort of mixed figure. He's this sort of beneficent dictator of communications. Yeah. And like all those systems, they're attractive in their way, it just depends on who's in charge. And he himself was an attractive figure. And so when you read that history, unless you just hate monopoly altogether, you're a little bit torn to feel, he's sort of sympathetic. But
then the problem is with that being the case, the problem is a few decades later you get ridiculous things like Hush-a-phone, Carter phone, all that nonsense. Do you think there's a straight line between Vail and X25?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I think there's a straight line between Vail. I wouldn't focus on X25. Just
an example.
Yeah. I think there is. I think the strongest line today, the strongest proponent of the Vail ideology today, is mobile phone systems. Yeah. So if you look at, without even noticing, and this is particularly true in the United States, everything that the Bell system once wanted or aspired to, it has in the American phone market. They control the towers, they control all long distance, they control all local, they control the handsets, they control billing, they control internet service. Everything up and down the top is Bell. Now there's a sort of mythology that there's competition in that market. There are four carriers, but in terms of the level of vertical integration, it is exactly back where the Bell system is. And especially in the United States, and maybe it's different in Europe to some extent. The United States, there's no choosing an internet carrier on your telephone. It's the Bell company. Yeah. It's all Bell up and down the top, and the level of control over that network. There's some inroads. The iPhone is kind of something of a compromised product. Android, Google is sort of trying to attack it, but there is, at its central, it's a very Vailist system?
Well, actually, Google is an interesting question there, because with your example of Vail, you've got this attractive guy who sets up an infrastructure that maybe leads to other things at certain points. So Google, don't be evil. They don't seem to be evil. But on the one hand, in some cases, there's talk about Google being involved in WiMAX ventures. So they may be providing infrastructure. They're certainly controlling your search and your data. So that as far as the end-to-end principle you mentioned at the beginning goes, you may have a point where Google are at both ends.
Right.
And let's say the current generation of don't be evil people fades away.
Right.
Is that something you're worried about, or
I have
a chapter? They're different.
I have a chapter called "The Temptation of Google." So Google is interesting because it's at once it is a company that, at least from what it says, combines the attractiveness of the internet's philosophy, the sort of Republican vision of rule by many, with this sense of public duty that Vail brought. So it has both of those attractive features, and the question is whether it can last. And I think you're right, and they are continually tempted to break from their founding principles. I have one example. Google spent a lot of money buying YouTube.
Yeah,
they could have killed YouTube.
Yeah,
doing an agreement with the carriers,
or a content provider or something.
Yeah, they could have killed them, or a content provider. They could have done the deal that killed YouTube before they bought them. That was the price of their dedication to network neutrality, in a sense. They spent $1.65 billion because of net neutrality, because they believe in net neutrality, open internets. They're a centrally interesting figure. One of the things I think in the book is I'm not completely cynical about companies. In other words, I believe there's such a thing as an enlightened corporation. It's possible. And I think if you don't force corporations with a lot of power to even think that they should have any duty, you'll get what you ask for. You know what I mean? I think it's been what we've let companies do for the last several decades, just sort of abandon any sense of, particularly in information companies. I mean, we're not talking about, screwdrivers here. We're talking about companies that are controlling information and communication. And particularly in the United States, there's been this idea, well, they have no duties to anyone except for shareholders. I think this has been a dramatic error in the way we think about that sector. It has always been a public calling, to use the English common law phrase, to carry information.
Can I ask you about the idea of the republic? What we know is that there's probably a lot of citizens to that republic.
Right.
The new generation are used to these kind of norms. Taking it back to the beginning, I spoke to Steve Crocker. This is the guy who was up. He was up in his friend's bathroom writing the first RFC and all that. And here's another question about a straight line. Is there a straight line between Crocker and the early communities, the well, the hackers, all that stuff? And is that translating to people who can keep that going, the republic? Because you mentioned Surf. That generation are still doing what they always were, and they are remarkable figures. Right. Who's going to replace them? We have the citizens, but do we have the leaders of the new republic?
It's a great question. You have to hope so. Yeah. I think that the amount of money has been very dangerous for this republic. I mean, it's built it into something mighty, but it's also been dangerous. I think you have to look to the ethics of engineers as they're growing up now, and what they believe and what they are taught as the point where you find whether this is passed on, this sort of spirit of republicanism, or whether it's just becomes. I think a lot of engineers. I think this is something that people learn in almost a constitutional way, that these open designs are something important and valuable. Because when someone tries to do something, when Comcast in the United States started blocking BitTorrent, you really do have a reaction, which is not just which is a felt reaction. People feel this is our internet and you're messing with it. I chair a nonprofit called Free Press, which is a media reform group. And we get angry crowds on internet issues. I think some people really feel this stuff. Yeah. And I think that's what I'm the most inspired by.
I guess the last question, because at some point you have to return to your wife upstairs. So I'm going to fit in two, now that I think about it, sorry.
Yeah.
That idea of norms, citizens, all that stuff. If you think about the internet as a global commons, as a new high seas, and as let's say the cyber pirates, as a kind of a new set of privateers, you know, are they controlled by a state or are they not? Lots of vagueness. Question about which flag they're flying at any one moment. To what extent are states helping or not helping in the emergence of norms that eventually get to, instead of some sort of customary law, but some proper understanding that actually has an impact in the next 100 or 200 years? And also the other final long question, big question, but I can say.
Who do you mean? Who do you mean by that? Do you mean Nigerian?
Actually, I can give a great example.
Yeah.
We had two different speakers from Estonia. One was the president, Ivers, and the other was kind of a net guru guy.
Right.
And both of them were separately speaking about the Estonia cyber attacks.
Right.
And, the first speaker said, listen, the Norwegians asked us, for a little bit of advice before they launched their Eurovision.
Right.
Now, the Eurovision, you're in the States, you don't know. Eurovision is about as trivial as it gets. And we told them, you need to have resilient servers because you're going to get attacks. One country won't like your song, and they'll attack you.
You mean the contest for everybody?
Yeah.
I've seen that. You think I'm...
Yeah. So,
I've seen that.
So here's the surprise. The Norwegians got hammered. There were DDoS attacks.
Really?
Over the Eurovision.
Wow.
So anyone. So you've got your scam artists, but you also have possible state intervention or whatever.
Right.
So
the question is whether the state is doing the right thing in those areas.
And is there a right thing to do?
Yeah. This is kind of the topic of the first book I wrote, more than this current book. And I think it's a challenging question for me. In that book, I say that states, that in the end, physical coercion is still extremely important. That
the kinetic option.
What's that?
The kinetic option.
The kinetic option. Right. And that, even though it's sort of a virtual world and these other things, that what will matter most to maintaining order will still be the threat of punishment, the real threat of physical punishment. And I guess I still think that that if there is to be order for those types of things, that they will all depend ultimately on some level of physical coercion or more advanced filtering systems. But there's a challenge, and Jonathan's Citrain, this is really his topic. The challenge of trying to maintain some level of security without turning it into the internet into a toaster. Yeah.
Right. The last question is, as I said, a very broad one. So I mentioned Hoshiphone, Cardphone, all that stuff. What are the next? Damn it, there's still another. What are the next big Hoshiphone?
I'll tell you right now.
And is it net neutrality what you're working on now, or is it something further?
No. The question is mobile internet. Is whether there will be a Carterphone rule for the mobile internet. Whether the rules of net neutrality, which are the default for the regular internet, will migrate to mobile or not. That is the battle.
You better explain that.
Okay. So the question is whether the basics, so important to the development of the internet, was this idea of being able to attach devices to the telephone network. That's how you were able. When I was a teenager, I had a BBS. Why? Because I could attach, a bulletin system. Because I could attach a modem.
Yeah.
That was critical.
Yeah.
You don't have those rules, particularly in the United States. You don't have the freedom to attach devices.
Right.
You don't have the freedom to run applications yet.
Yeah.
It is the mobile internet the mobile networks are highly constrained.
Yeah.
And the question is whether the norms. There's a battle between these two platforms, computer and mobile phone platform, as to what norms will rule those platforms.
Right.
And I'm not sure who's going to win.
Does Android not at least mean there's an option?
Android is, like Radio Free America or something. It's an effort. It's an effort. It's almost an ideological tool.
Yeah.
Android.
Yeah.
They've got an uphill battle. that is a foray into enemy territory.
Yeah.
From an ideological perspective.
Okay.
This is like a pilot project. It's like being the one democracy in the Middle East or something. It's like the one pilot project to try and be completely open in an environment which is not used to that.
Mm.
The mobile networks are, and the culture of those industries. Now, I know more about the American industry side than the European side. Are fundamentally different than the Internet's. They are, as I said, the descendants of the Bell system.
I'll just say, while we're on the record, that we had lunch here a few months ago with Vivian Redding, that's the European Information Commissioner, and we had the head of Microsoft Ireland and Google Ireland and various large, small players around the table. And what came across was that she felt that the Commission has a role in controlling what the mobile industry is doing.
Right.
And there were, people were actually quite happy in many cases to hear the kind of lengths that she was willing to go to.
Well, I'll say something about the new FCC.
Yeah.
I can't say too much about the new FCC, but I believe that this will be their challenge. The Obama.
Right. Yeah.
The Obama. Julius Jurnikowski, the chairman. This will be his. I think this will be his story. Who knows what else might happen, but I think the mobile networks will be, and their development will be the question for the next 5 years or so.
Well, we'll leave it on that. Listen, thank you very much. Sure. That was great.
Great. Well, your questions are